Brown says, get that India, big boy.
Call an ambulance! Maybe call a police! Oh, what a shot! What a shot! Campbell killer!
Hello and welcome back to an unscheduled but probably expected bonus podcast from the Tip Sheet. As always, I'm your host, John, also known as 4020. And tell me if you've heard this one before, 60s, but the Parramatta Eels appoint the young, or relatively young, given he's a coach, rising coach out of Melbourne. It's maybe the surprise pick, this one, with Jason Ryles winning out over Josh Hannay, given that Hannay was the popular candidate through the process, at least unofficially. But yeah, following in the steps of Brad Arthur, Steve Kearney, I'm sure I'm forgetting someone there as well, but the Eels go for the option from Melbourne.
Yes, good morning to you and our listeners, John. Monday morning recording.
Yeah.
What do you know? Yes, so it was a little bit of a surprise, only in that our mail was that Josh Hannay had his nose just in front. But in terms of candidates, they were probably pretty much on a par, because when you're talking about appointing someone to their first full-time gig as a head coach, and we spoke about this once the search went on for a coach, that you are looking at basing the decision literally on a regular sort of recruitment process of resume in terms of their experience at an assistant coach level, interview and references. But, you know, as far as a resume of first grade coaching, or head coaching sort of roles, Hannay had that little bit as an interim coach. But, you know, both of the main candidates for the job, or the ones that the Eels had been said to have narrowed it down to, came in with that strong assistant coach background. And it's really now a case of time to start being in charge of the team. And that's now the new era that we're in, with a coach who hasn't been an NRL head coach before, but has a lot of people in and around football who rate him highly for his potential to be a successful head coach. And I will say as well, John, that you messaged me with some rumours that were going around about celebrations at the Ryles household on the weekend. So that it was said that there was a bit of a gathering and a celebration at his house, and the tip was, looks like he's got the job. So it seems to have maybe fitted in. Now, whether that was a fake rumour and it just happens by chance that Jason Ryles is the successful candidate, I mean, we won't ever really know about that unless Jason comes out and says, yes, we had some celebrations at my place over the weekend. But it was interesting still that that rumour came out, which seemed to fly in the face of some of the mail around that Hannay was going to get the gig.
Yeah, it's always interesting how much you put stock into those sort of rumours. But given the proximity to any sort of potential announcement, you had to at least consider it. And so in my mind, that's probably when Hannay fell behind Ryles. It wasn't to say that the mail was, sterling silver in its quality, but when something like that pops up, it sort of always gives you pause. So at that point, I think Ryles probably slipped ahead of Hannay in my mind. And yeah, here we are, Monday morning, a 4-year deal for Parramatta's next commander-in-chief. And yeah, it's going to be an interesting juncture for the club now, because getting the head coach appointed is obviously one of the biggest holes that they had to get filled. But by no means does it get us out of the quagmire that we've been mired down in across the last, depending on your point of view, couple of weeks, couple of months, year and a bit, with the other issues that are ongoing at the club. And that's going to be the biggest challenge for Jason Ryles, is he inherits a roster that's got obviously some very talented key pieces. Mitchell Moses at the peak of his powers, Dylan Brown, on the rise, some good young players here and there. But there's very clearly holes. There's an aging forward pack. Quentin Gufferson's on the back nine of his career, putting his body for absolute torture to, try and help the team. He's got some tough calls to make, and I don't envy him. But as a fan, I certainly hope that he can get the best out of the club. And I suppose, speaking of the best, massive shout out to the sponsors of the tip sheet, Star Partners Real Estate, Auburn, Narellan and Parramatta. Even for the emergency podcast, they're giving us some support. So thank you to Greg and the crew. Now, let's go into Jason Ryles a little bit more, 60s, because obviously we're 4 years ahead as the Parramatta Eels head coach. We're going to need to get to know him. And this is what he brings to the table. Obviously, we remember him as a prop from his playing days, where he played primarily for the Dragons, but also for the Roosters too. Started his coaching career, post-playing career in 2014. He's been an assistant coach with the Melbourne Storm from 16 to 20, 2016 to 2020, where he was part of their four grand final stretch, including 2 wins. He was assistant coach with the English rugby team during 2020 and 2021, and assistant coach with the Roosters between 2022 and 2023, which is when there was that big tug war between him and the Storm. And then I believe when he considered the gig for the Dragons, the Roosters let him walk back to Melbourne, the way things shook out there. So they said, the club, the operative word there, said that they were looking to bring in someone with a culture of success, someone that, knows how to win and has been around that sort of environment. And I suppose in that regard, Jason Ryles absolutely fits the mold there, given his ties to both the Storm and the Roosters. So I suppose I'm now going to hand over the keys to the podcast to you, mate, and you can tell me, first impressions, what you think are his biggest hurdles. I don't know, what do you want to talk about when it comes to Jason Ryles and the Parramatta Eels?
Okay, well, let's focus on the positive to start off with, because I think it's important that when we have a new coach that's appointed, that supporters get behind him. It doesn't matter your feelings on the process that the Eels went through, and that I wasn't a fan of a mid-season sacking, and everyone knows I was a supporter of Brad Arthur. And by the way, congratulations to him on his coaching appointment in England. I also am pleased that he's gone to a club that carries the blue and gold colours over there. But, I think we all knew he was going to get a gig very, very quickly. But moving on from, no matter how you feel about the process that went about it, it's important that supporters get behind the new coach. We will dive into what we see needs to be done within the club moving forward from this point. But now that a coach has been appointed, I think it's very important that he gets support. Now, we're about to talk about the support that he needs from the club. I think it's important that Eels supporters also get behind him and his appointment, no matter how you feel about what's transpired to this process, because the only way, if you're an Eels supporter, the only way we can move forward is firstly being united in support for the club. Now, that doesn't mean you can't call for things that you want to be done better. And everyone who listens to our podcast knows that we think there are a number of things that must be done better. But first and foremost, the love of the club has to be something that stays with us, and that means getting behind a new coach. There's no value to be had out of death riding or being anything but positive going forward for Jason Ryles. So he's come from a winning culture, and look, that was obviously part of what was attractive about Brad Arthur. there was obviously something that was attractive about Stephen Kearney before that. So BA was obviously a lot more successful than Stephen Kearney, and they feel that culture down at Melbourne is something that is. I don't think they want to transplant any culture in that regard, but rather look for someone who's come from a background where high standards are expected. So there's that. Now, the other aspect too is I believe that Jason Ryles has done a lot of study, not just around coaching, but in terms of people management as well. So I think that was a bit of a selling point for his background, for him getting the gig. He's also been a coach in demand. So clubs have sought him out in the past. You referenced before that he looked like he was going to go to St. George. That didn't transpire. So he's been selective in the club that he's wanted to go to. So let's talk about why he would want to come to Parramatta. So let's keep it on the positive perspective. We know the issues that we've got at the moment, but from a positive perspective, you're looking at a club where off-field, in terms of the business side of things, the Eels are and have been in a very good position financially. They are about to have, within the next 6 months or so, a new centre of excellence open up at Kellyville. You're talking about them playing out of the best suburban rectangular stadium, rugby league stadium in Australia, in CommBank Stadium. You were talking about a very strong junior rugby league base. You were talking about memberships that are right at the very top of the NRL. You're talking about a fan base, which is one of the biggest in rugby league. So you've got a whole lot of positives that are there. Now, shortly we'll be going into the areas that they need to fix, but there's going to be attractiveness about coming to the Eels. Now, the Eels have talked about having a strong roster. We will try to keep it realistic about that in what we're about to talk about. But there are still the nucleus of strong players within the club, so we have to highlight that. And we also would say that there are a number of pathways players who are starting to emerge who can be the foundation of a strong future for the club. So there are some positives around the Eels that would have been attractive to Jason Ryles, and you're not going to take up a head coaching position at a club that's currently sitting at the bottom of the table, and deservedly so right now, unless you felt that there was real potential for success for you as a coach. Because, as we just said, he's had opportunities to be a head coach before. He's been sought after. So he sees something in it for him in being appointed as the head coach of the Parramatta Eels. So, John, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I mean, you sort of set the table nicely there. Whoever it was going to be, whether it was Ryles, Hannay, or any other candidate, they get the benefit of the doubt of having a blank canvas coming into this. And I know that it's far more complex than that when it comes to like what they're inheriting and what the issues are going to have to be dealing with, what we're going to talk about. But as a coach, I'm going to give them a fair go. And yeah, with Jason, absolutely, he gets 4 years or presumptively 4 years. That's how long his contract runs for, but you never know in the NRL these days. But he gets 4 years to try and turn Parramatta around and shape it in his image. I'm interested to see what that entails. When it comes down to him and Hannay, I don't think there was saying there wasn't a right or wrong option is probably not the right phrasing. I don't think there was a wrong option there. They've both been relatively hot property in the coaching market for the last couple of years.
Can I just jump in there, John, and say that's probably a very good way of putting it, in terms of that there wasn't going to be a wrong option with whichever way that the club went in that regard. So, yeah, well, I just wanted to jump in and say, yeah, that's I like the way you framed that.
And like I said, going to give him my full support, knowing that much like player sort of talent evaluation, and we speak about how it can be an imprecise science, and it is, no matter how talented someone is on the field, there are so many other factors that go into being a great NRL player. The same thing holds true of coaching. You can be a great assistant coach, and we've seen some of the most highly credentialed assistant coaches in recent years struggle as head coaches. Vice versa, you can be a relative, not no name, but a much lesser quote-unquote pedigree or star assistant coach and be a very good NRL coach. There is no exact measure of what's going to, help a coach make that jump between being 2IC and being the big dog. It's not easy. Man management, roster management, all the different things that you're juggling, all the ball, the football balls, metaphorically and physically, I suppose, that you're juggling, really push these guys. So,
John, this is, and excuse me for jumping in here, but I think this is probably a good juncture to say, we, as we both just said, we're going to get behind the coach, and that there are positives about coming to the Eels, but let's now temper this and say we have to have realistic expectations about what is going to now happen from this point forward, in saying what Jason Ryles will be able to achieve is very much going to be dependent on what the club does in support of Jason Ryles from this point forward. And I think that's probably a good point for us to now jump in and talk about some of the tough calls that the club might have to make, because there are tough calls in terms of the roster. There are some self-reflective calls that they're going to have to deal with in terms of their processes that they go through in a number of areas. There are also decisions that the club is going to have to make with regard to engagement with the supporter base, and that's, like for supporters, that's an important issue. It's probably not quite as important when it comes to achieving success on the field, but we don't want to ignore that as well. So, John, for you, what are the tough calls that you believe will have to be made with the roster from this point forward? Because we don't have a lot of time to waste with regard to this, because players, if you're going to make a tough call, we're now getting towards the pointy end of the season, and you don't want to be heading into a pre-season without what the squad will be for next year sorted. And let's face it, if we are going in with the same roster next year, I wouldn't expect vastly different results.
Yeah, and that's fair. That is more than fair. I mean, we've made our gripes about the roster situation known pretty well and clearly at this point, both before and after the sacking of Brad Arthur. So it's not like we've changed our tune either way. And, you look through backline and forward pack and you see issues. We don't have a top 30, and people can say otherwise. I'm not saying that people on our website are, but there's been some talk about the top 30 its quotas being met by historic contracts rather than current contracts. That's not a recipe for success. When you're using technicalities to say that you're meeting your top 30 quotas, that's got to change straight away. But you look at the back line, no depth there. You've got an albatross contract with Mike Acevo, who unfortunately did his hamstring. Like that's beyond his control, but he's done his hamstring again. Makes him a prime candidate to be moved on. Like we said, lack of depth in the back line. at both centre and wing, but especially wing. You look at the forward pack, a lot's been said about an ageing pack, and that's not unfair criticism. I think that Jason Ryles and whoever he brings on as part of his brains trust, and that's something we talk about 260s, is what direction does he maybe go with assistance. But they're going to have to make some tough calls there, because you need to keep some of your senior forwards to build around, not to build around, but to be part of that augmentation slot in your roster. But you can't have as much money as Eels have tied up in a pack that is performing the way it is. Now, does he think that maybe he can get more out of those guys, and maybe he's less aggressive in culling out for that roster? Perhaps. But, it's also a fair, not even criticism, but just observation that the Eels do have a lot of salary cap allocated to the forward pack. And maybe even with a coach that feels he can get more out of him, I'm not sure if he can get enough out of him to balance the books there in terms of the salary cap to on-field performance. So,
John, I was just going to say the issue with the forwards, you can make a case for age not being a factor throughout the NRL. And you can make a case where every forward would have a selling point for keeping them.
Mm-hmm.
But what we're talking about, and I think which is what you were saying, is the collective. So collectively, we have an older forward pack. Collectively, we have a massive amount of the cap tied into forwards. And for significant change to be made, there needs to be the injection of something new into those forwards. And we saw that a little bit with Charlie Geimer on the weekend, about just that raise in the energy levels of a younger, aggressive forward coming in there. So we're not putting a slight on any of the forwards individually, although there's plenty of criticism for individuals out there. What we're saying is that we can't go under the current iteration of the roster. There has to be change. And even if Jason Ryles feels that he can get more out of the forwards as they currently are, that he feels he can get more out of the roster, and that there are issues beyond, I guess that it's more of a current form issue than anything else. That he might be feeling that. We feel otherwise. So, and I think, I guess ultimately the only opinion that matters will be that of Jason Ryles, but he has to be. We hope that he gets the main say, the absolute main say in what happens with the roster.
And sort of parallel to everything we just spoke about, with his appointment, I hope it means he'll start to move faster when it comes to retention below the NRL level. When you're identifying your, whether it's blue chip or just solid first grade prospects, with Ryles now at the helm, I hope the Eels can stop bleeding the talent that they have in recent years. Because you look at other squads and you see Ethan Sanders leaving this year, which I'm not gonna be too brutal on the club for, because I think that there was a lot of extenuating circumstances there in terms of the talent ahead of him on the roster that would always made it difficult to retain Ethan. But you look around the NRL and you see Trey Mooney, you see Miles Martin, and there's a couple other players there out there as well that should have been part of our core NRL team. And it's obviously Stefano Utoikamanu out of the West Tigers, who really kicked off our big debate on the Parramatta internal systems, didn't it? 60s. That was like the one that really started the snowball rolling down the hill on how the Eels sort of dragged their heels too much with especially retention, but also recruitment.
This is where I was talking about with those, the processes have to change.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we know that the recruitment and retention committee, or they have a group of I believe it's 5 people that are involved in that, and they'll have their meetings to make decisions about recruitment and retention. But we just need things for whatever the process is with the decisions. It has to be more aggressive. It has to be, or it has to be more streamlined. It has to be more decisive. It cannot operate the same way it's been operating, because without question, we have missed out on signing targets, and it may be for a variety of reasons. That whoever the target was, that we didn't like the deal that they wanted, whether it be the size of the contract, the length of the contract, whatever it might have been. There comes a time where you really have to bite the bullet, and I'm not sure that we've always bitten the bullet the way that we have. And the other aspect, of course, is, and you mentioned this just then when you're talking about retention, and you were talking about some of the blue chip pathways players coming through, and again, being more decisive with it. Like, I'm not sure how much more you need to know sometimes about certain players as to, for when you decide that, okay, this is the way that we go with this player. And you just referenced then Stefano. Now, he should have been locked up before the Eels got to the point of being ready to debut him. So that's just one example. We don't want to go into in this podcast historically the things that we think should have happened a lot faster, because we're not in the middle of the club. We don't know the ins and outs of what's happened, but the proof is in the pudding, isn't it? For where we are. We wouldn't be where we are now at the bottom of the table if mistakes weren't being made. And the club can do plenty of pointing at Brad Arthur as previous coach and say, look, we need to move in a different direction. It's not working here. If the club is going to suggest that every mistake was a Brad Arthur mistake and that everything else was spot on, then we won't be moving forward at all, because mistakes were made by the club in a number of areas, in our opinion, around the football operation and roster and that sort of thing. So the most important thing to do is to admit mistakes have been made, fix them, and that decisiveness in roster, in the roster, in recruitment, in retention, to me, has to be prioritised. Absolutely has to be prioritised. We're not calling for people to be sacked. We're just calling for the processes aren't working. The proof is in the pudding. The processes don't work. They have to be changed. So whatever the club needs to do to streamline things, to get more aggressive, to be more decisive, it has to change.
Yeah, that's fair. That is very fair, and it goes all the way back to, like I said, that conversation that kicked off with Stefano way back now, in COVID, the start of COVID times, essentially. And
hey, wasn't it just on Stefano? Wasn't it interesting? We're having the conversation about Stefano in recording the preview podcast. So it just happened to be that very afternoon that there was news in the media about the Eels actually being interested in Stefano, and where he was at in his in looking at his next deal. So we actually had no word, and we don't know. We still don't know whether the club is truly interested in Stefano and bringing him home. We hope that they are, and that they do pursue him aggressively. But that was an opinion from us chatting about it. last week. There was no inside word whatsoever. So if it turns out that it is something that's being discussed by the club and Stefano, then hopefully that's a step in the direction that we want the club to be moving in. So aggressively pursuing a player that is in demand in the NRL. So, sorry about that, John.
No, it's perfectly fine. I think it went along what I was saying pretty much in lockstep. But, yeah, Ryles being appointed head coach means, like you said, that it's not the silver bullet, that the club has a lot of introspection and stuff it needs to handle in the wake of the Brad Arthur sacking now, that it's pretty clear things aren't working in certain aspects, and just getting a new head coach is going to fix that. And so it becomes now, this complementary process that if we want to move forwards and we want to go back to being a competitive NRL franchise that aspires to win a premiership, we have other processes we need to be fixing. In saying that, I am very excited to see what Ryles can do with the team and where he can take, assuming that we keep him more, where he can take this roster with an injection of young talent that we're starting to see via the work, obviously, of Brad now gone, but Trent in his place as the interim head coach, seeing Charlie Geimer, Matt Arthur, hopefully maybe some guys like Jock Braswell, Saxon Pryke at the back end of this year as well. And that's going to be one of the big ways they turn it around, because the reality is right now we're under cap pressure, and how we got there is a bit frustrating given that we haven't had a top 30, but the Eels clearly don't have the cap flexibility to, it's either they don't have the cap flexibility to go out and sign someone, or they seem to think that you can be competitive with a top 26 or top 27. Now, if you're just subscribing to Occam's razor, where the simplest answer is most likely answer, I'd say that we've probably overspent elsewhere in the roster. And that's going to be, A, both a handicap to Ryles and what he needs to do, and B, one of the biggest hurdles for him to get over, both moving on, as we spoke about, tapping guys on the shoulder, but then finding guys to replace him. And that's going to be so difficult for next year now. So he doesn't inherit an ideal situation.
Yeah, and I think this is where we have to be realistic in our expectations. So we're saying, first of all, we need to look at the roster, make big calls about which forwards we can and we believe are best to keep, and then look at whether they hit the market not if we hit the market, but where we hit the market with regard to those forwards, and where we look to use up-and-coming players to, I guess, fill the breach with the forwards. Now, when it comes to the backs, we have a number of unproven young players that have had a very hampered 2024 due to injury. So we haven't been able to determine how much we can rely on them as opposed to how much we have to hit the market, the player market, in that regard. So we're talking about Arthur Miller-Stephen. We're talking about Richie Penasini. We're talking about Ethan Martin. So players like that who may well have been in line for making an NRL appearance before. Artie's already made an NRL debut last year and literally made that transition from being SG ball to NRL in a rapidly quick period of time. But he was still sitting outside the top 30 and outside development coming into this year. So his was an interesting situation. But I think it's, even with those players in there and being genuine hopes for the future, you still have to be honest and look and go, as you said, John, the depth isn't there in the back line. The strike power has been proven to not being there in the back line this year. So change is needed. But Lomax on his own isn't going to change things. And look, it will be also helpful. Bailey Simonson was our best outside back this year, and his injury was a blow to the team. But we know that in order for the Eels to match the way that the game is being played these days, the pace that's in the team, we have to look at, is there someone with elite pace that we can bring in? And we really do have to have an eye to the future, don't we, in that regard? So recruitment, those recruitment and retention decisions that are coming in for Jason Ryles, I'm sure that all of the coaches that were interviewed would have given their honest opinion about the roster. I would be stunned if any of them said, I'm completely happy with what your roster looks like. I can't see any way that they would have been saying
there
that.
are such glaring holes from the very fact that it's not a full top 30 through to, as we spoke about, lack of depth in the back line, aging forward pack. You do get a mostly pretty good spine. You get a top 2 halfback, one of the best young 5'8", a warhorse at fullback that, like we said, is obviously putting his body through hell for the team, but he still, is a very, it's doing him a huge disservice to call him very competent, but let's say as a baseline, a very competent fullback. And then, dummy half, you don't have the long-term proven option locked in right now, but you do have a handy, pardon the pun, utility guy in Brendan, and a great young option in Matt Arthur. But yeah, the roster is, like you said, if they were having honest conversations in their appointment process, then they would have said that yes, there's clearly stuff to work with in the roster, but it's not a balanced and competitive roster.
That's right. And again, I'll come back to it. We're not talking about individuals. We're talking about the collective. The collective is not working. You can make a case of why you can keep player A, B, C, whatever, and valid reasons for keeping them. You're not going to go through and suddenly sack half the team. We're not talking about that. But you need to be selective about which of the experienced veteran players that you are going to keep, because you cannot have the numbers of them playing together that we do this year. And this isn't, again, this isn't anything that's ageist in any way, shape or form. It's just the evidence is there this year. We've lost the battle of the forwards in virtually every game, despite on paper having names. Like on paper, you go, well, geez, that should be one of the strongest packs in the competition. Well, maybe a number of years ago it was. And unfortunately, it just hasn't happened this year. So anyway, that's probably the main thing that, needs to change next year, along with the processes by which we formulate that roster.
Mm-hmm.
John, outside of that, the next step is, I guess, who will Ryles bring in as his staff?
Yeah, we then that's probably one of the more interesting parts of the entire coaching process is no one really talks about what a potential candidate brings in that aspect. Assistants, any other specialty coaching staff that can be part of their football staff hierarchy. And yeah, I don't really know. Does Trent raid Melbourne's, deeper assistant coaching stocks? It's Jason raid Melbourne's deeper coaching stocks there. What's his relationship with Trent Barrett? They were teammates for 7 years at St. George, I believe. Usually incoming coaches don't keep, incumbent assistant coaches. Will there be an exception there? I don't know. We usually as well. I feel like when the coach is locked in and the media gets a hold of it, they've usually got some early links about who's going to be the assistant coach. But I'm not seeing anything being announced by any of the premier media outlets like the Daily Telegraph or Sydney Morning Herald. So yeah, I don't really know which direction he's going to take it. It's going to be very, very interesting though, because that it's every bit as important as the head coach itself, the assistants, and how they're going to shape this team defensively in particular, but also offensively. I suppose we have to keep our ears to the ground and wait and see. But he's got connections obviously at the Roosters and in Melbourne primarily, so I would assume that's where he's going to be looking to pull his auxiliary coaching talent from. I don't know about you, big fella. Do you have any ideas or inklings about where he could go for his full coaching staff?
Well, I think to me, it seems almost a certainty that there will be a complete change in the staffing at the club, because when they cut ties with Brad, I guess what was going to be the constant for the players was that all of the assistants were in place, and blokes like Steve Murphy, who has been there for the entirety of Brad's coaching appointment. So he was still there. So he remains that familiar face, the familiar voice, maintains that continuity. Craig Sultana as the football manager, he's been there for, I think, the majority of the time that Brad's been there now. So they were able to maintain a level of continuity to help the players with that adjustment to Brad being sacked. But moving forward, a coach is going to bring in the people that he knows. And I don't know that Ryles has any familiarity with the present staff, maybe with the exception of Trent Barrett. But given that he was competing with him for the top job, I doubt that Trent's going to be kept there. You would assume that it's going to be people that he's worked with in the past, unless it's people that he's had his eye on that are around at other clubs and has been thinking, maybe he sounded them out in the past. Maybe he sounded them out even before he's applied, at the time that he's applied for the Eels job. Look, if I'm successful with this, would you consider coming on board as part of my staff? So who knows what that will be. I mean, way back when Stephen Kearney was appointed, he brought with him Brad Arthur. And I'm pretty sure Craig Sultana was down at the Storm with both BA and Stephen Kearney as well. So it's there's always seems to be connections, doesn't there, when a new coach is appointed,
mm-hmm.
that they have people that they've worked with that they have faith in to do the job that, when to help them to be a success. So it'd be a surprise if it's not someone that he's worked with in the past.
Yeah, I think that'll be the big binding factor there. It's just a matter of outside looking. I'm not sure who that's going to be. Like I said, whether he poaches from the Melbourne or Sydney Roosters staff, who knows? He's been involved in the New South Wales Blues setup at some points, I believe, at least maybe as an assistant. So he might have guys he knows via that too.
John, what are you seeing? What are you seeing this morning in the way of the rugby league world reaction to it, the media reaction to it? I've only heard a little bit on the news on the radio, and it's been basically a positive
Yeah,
reaction.
neutrals seem to have reacted positively. Again, I think that is reflective of the fact that if we'd gone Hannay or Ryles, I don't think there would have been much pushback from neutrals who were being, properly critical and not, just having an agenda for or against Parramatta in that regard. But yeah, people seem to think Ryles was a good appointment. But again, there's so much we don't know, isn't there? I wouldn't say we're doing this blind, but like I said, it's an imprecise science about making that jump from assistant to head coach. So I don't think the club made the bad call here or made a bad call. But neutral seem to think it's a solid appointment. I think Parramatta fans, by and large, whether they were pro Hannay or pro Ryles, I think the overwhelming sentiment is that it's good to finally just have a head coach.
Okay, now the next thing is, because we've talked about our response to the appointment. We've talked about the work that the club is going to need to do to support Jason Ryles. We've talked about what the media reaction has been thus far. Next step is, wonder what the player response is going to be. Whether you are going, I don't know whether they're going to dive too much into it publicly, because on top of everything else, one of the contenders for the job is Trent Barrett, and he's currently coaching them. So there would be an awkwardness about singing the praises of Jason Ryles too much by the current players. However, I would expect that they will be pressed for their opinions. So it'll be interesting to see what they do say publicly. But then secondly, it'd be interesting to, get any word about what the response is within the playing group anyway, like the true, honest response. Now, I would imagine that there's going to be an element of positivity about that. I imagine that there is going to be an element where, okay, it's good that we now have clarity about who the coach is going to be, because there are contracts that need to be sorted out. We've heard that people like Jermaine Hopgood had been committing to an extension without knowing who the head coach was. There would be other players within the club who, in looking to sign, and obviously we're talking about Blaise Talangi. He would have been wanting to know who the coach is going to be. You'd be talking about Bailey Simonson, who'd be negotiating a new deal for next year because his current deal was coming to an end. And there'd be other players that are either, looking at upgrades or maybe even thinking about a move out of the club. So they needed clarity. What do you think the reaction's going to be, John? I mean, it'd be hard to imagine they'd be saying anything other than positive things at this stage.
I think it's probably going to be pretty close to what fans had, is that, thank goodness it's over. Thank goodness we now have a coach. Now we can sit down and have a proper discussion about what this means for me as player A, B, C, Y, or D. Whatever, player has a various stake or issue with the club moving forwards, whether it's a unsigned young talent like Blaise Talangi or if it's a senior player like Mitchell Moses or Quinton Gufferson. So, yeah, I think relief will be the prevailing emotion right now. The fact that the team individuals can finally start moving forwards, and whether it's, with the Eels or somewhere else, who knows? Because there's, like we've talked about in this podcast, there's some pretty heavy conversations that have to be made or had in that regard for some players on the roster. And there's some huge calls they have to make in order to convince players like Blaise Talangi to stick around, and Jermaine Hopgood to extend his stay at the club, because they're the guys that you're hoping to be building the club around moving forwards. But yeah, you've got to think with the playing group that they're just happy that, this inertia that they've been absolutely, stuck with has finally, had another outside force acting on it, and the club's now moving in an actual direction that we want to be going towards.
Yeah, and I wonder then, as a consequence of that, are we going to start to see any change in current performance? And by that I mean the players are literally in their audition for the incoming coach right now, aren't they? I mean, it's not that the coaches, the Jason Ryles, wouldn't be well aware of how players have been performing this year, but perhaps this is the motivator to extract a little bit more from the players this year, because what we're seeing in these recent weeks is inconsistency in effort. We're not seeing effort on effort plays. It's been referenced quite a bit since the last Thursday's game about the fact that there were tries that were conceded where all it took was just a standard effort from some players to back up the effort of other players and tries to shut down. And that didn't happen. So it seems like everyone isn't on the same page and as in the playing group. So if they are now potentially playing for their own futures, will we see improved performance? What's your gut reaction right at the moment, John? Are we going to see a lift from the players as a result of them having that clarity of the coach?
This is an interesting one because I understand the postulation here where, you now have a head coach and you want to impress him and therefore you want to try harder. But that's such and not your question, but from a player perspective, it's such a flawed mindset to have because the coach is now signed. We've got, 7 rounds, 6 rounds, 7 rounds, thereabouts left of football. So you've got 7 games to impress. And sure, but that you can look at it in that perspective. But the reality is that the coach is going to look at the tape of the preceding 5 or 6 rounds where you were either good, bad, whatever, somewhere in between without, the head coach being there. And surely they'll wait exactly as much as what they will for the games yet to be played. So I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised to see at least some players lift emotionally because, like I said, they've got someone locked in now, and some people will respond to that they do have a not even like a figurehead, but, just someone to now in their minds try and impress. But I don't hold out too many hopes in terms of a massive form turnaround 60s, short of maybe, and this would be absurd from Melbourne's perspective, but letting Ryles get in early and start shaping the team in his image, maybe that would lead to a turnaround. But if there were significant form turnarounds on an individual basis, purely by having a coach appointed, I would be surprised. Because, like I said, the fact that there's been over a month of tape now for him to go over and sort of assess where his new charges are at, would shape as much of the narrative for him based on personnel decisions to make moving forwards as it would be for the next 6-7 games on the schedule.
John, it's interesting that you use the term flawed mindset to say that would be the case if the Eels were to respond in that way, because you could suggest that the entire year has had a flawed mindset out there. So that's why it wouldn't necessarily surprise me. And human nature being what it is, this team is a team that is, without question, mentally jaded. Look, I've gone to training sessions and I've seen good energy and positivity and what have you, but that means nothing when the team goes out and looks obviously mentally jaded. And maybe it's the fillip to drawing something out of them in terms of motivation or energy. And I don't think it's a question of not caring. I just think it's I think for the players, it's felt like a season that's just got away from them in a way that they just did not expect. And in that regard, there's maybe even a similarity to the wooden spoon season in 2018 because it was totally unexpected in 2018. We know that what the problems were in 2018 in retrospect, and again it came down to the roster and what was happening in the game at the time with rule changes and how it impacted the roster as the Eels were back then. Because bizarrely, if you remember in 2018, we had a lot of players lose weight. They were at their lightest, most mobile, and rule changes brought in a whole lot of stoppages from referees blowing the pee out of the whistle through the early part of the season. And the teams with big, dominant forwards were being successful because they were getting plenty of rest time. Now, in 2024, we see that the game seems to have evolved towards faster, mobile players and the bigger forwards. And whilst there's still a place for some big forwards, the game has moved towards the more mobile, faster players. And we've seen that change in the lock role, for example, where the lock is like an extra member of the halves and plays that real playmaker role rather than that traditional big middle role that it had become in more recent times. So, it's interesting for what might happen now over the next few weeks in terms of whether mentally there's a recharge for the players or not. The best we seem to be hoping for right now anyway is to avoid the spoon. So we need whatever we can, don't we, to get something more out of the players. So anyway, John, is there anything more that you think we need to dive into before we wrap this up?
Obviously you could talk about this sort of thing, not ad nauseum, but for a long time. How much input does he now have over the roster decisions for this year? Is he going to be in contact with Trent Barrett saying, I need you to be playing, whatever young player in this position? Does he want to see Charlie Geimer on the edges? Does he want to see Charlie Geimer at lock forward? Does he want to see Jock Brazel, Saxon Pryke? What about reserve grade? Does he want to see, guys like we've been talking about, Mohamed Al-Madine and Sam Tuivasa getting the push up there? How hands-on is he going to be? That would be something you could talk about for a long time, because that's obviously going to be shaping the team's NRL, New South Wales Cup and Flag for both this year and beyond. The assistant coach thing again, there's so many mysteries there about who he's going to bring onto his staff. How deep is the roster churn going to be, not just at a playing level, but at a auxiliary staff level? What about trainers, high performance staff, scouts? Does he bring in his own scouts, people he wants to be scouting talent? So yeah, there is so many things that we're going to be trying to keep abreast of now, moving forwards. But for the time being,
Well, just before you say that, you've actually raised something that is we didn't dive into, and maybe we shouldn't spend too much time on it now because we're already at around that hour mark for this podcast. But the complications of taking someone who has a current role at a rival club, just how much can he provide in the way of input that isn't a conflict of interest?
Yeah, especially one that's pushing for the premiership. Melbourne have a great chance of running deep into the finals this year. So, yeah, how much?
The Storm will be happy for Jason Ryles that he's got himself a first grade gig, because I think every club deep down also likes to see that they produce success, not just for the club, but for the individuals within the club. But he has his current role as an assistant coach in the team that's challenging for the premiership this year. They wouldn't want him to be diverting his energies to a role that he doesn't take up till next year. But at the same time, for the Eels as a club, we need to start pushing forward now. So the club would be in communication with him about certain things that they would want. He'd probably be in communication with them and saying, look, I want this, want that. But, there obviously is a tipping point there with that. And selfishly, we have to be hoping that there is action happening right now that he's part of, because, again, if we do not get changes in how we do things, the change in coach alone won't turn things around significantly, certainly not next year. And as supporters, we hope against hope that things can be more immediate. We're done with waiting for better times at the club. We're done with waiting with a premiership. We don't want wasted years. These 2 years since the grand final, we're going to look back on it, and we're going to talk about false hope and wasted years.
The reality is that we have assembled, or had assembled, our best squad, arguably since the golden era, but, at least in the same ballpark as the 01 squad, in terms of individual talent, maybe better, because the 01 squad was like the perfect conglomeration of Brian Smith finding a flaw in the way the game was interpreted, and finding a way to exploit that, I suppose. Junior and Reg are some of the best bookends this club's ever had. Mitchell Moses is, without a doubt, one of the best halfbacks this club's ever had, and he now walks in the similar stratosphere as Peter Sterling in terms of a pure talent thing. And you sprinkle guys like Gufferson and Brown and the various different pieces we've had there, and it makes our, going back to that term I used before, our inertia in the wake of 2022 and the result that we saw in the grand final that much more frustrating. But it just means that Jason Ryles now needs to be, and it's just unfair to put it onto a guy who's just coming into the gig, but he is now the catalyst, or needs to be the catalyst for driving all this change, all this positive change for the club. So I really look forward to seeing what he can do. Can he elevate aspects of the roster that are already here beyond what we saw of Brad Arthur? It's going to be a challenge, because that was one of Brad's calling cards, was extracting a lot of juice out of
I think it was, mate. I think it was, to some extent, it may have been Brad's downfall in that he was able to get so much out of players that other clubs didn't want, that became what was accepted recruitment practice. So rather than going for high top-end recruits, we were looking for value recruits. And
that's what was so frustrating. Was I don't mind taking those, like I said, lottery ticket signings that we've called them in the past, or project signings, because by doing that, you should be opening up cap space elsewhere to get the low risk, high upside guys, to balance out your squad. But the Eels weren't doing that, and the acquisition of Zac Lomax is the first time we'd seen it in years, and unfortunately, it coincided with Brad Arthur getting the flick. So now Jason Ryles needs to, like I said, pilot a change in methodology, in culture, not necessarily away from taking those, lottery ticket guys, but making sure if we are going to get a, budget pickup on the long shot, that we can turn him into an NRL caliber player, that internally and externally we now have processes that will ensure that they're also being brought in alongside proven talent, or talent with legitimate upside that we can take a risk on. The way Canberra have altered their recruitment strategy this year to prioritise the New South Wales 19s team as their preferred sort of poaching ground.
Well, John, ultimately, what we have to look for is that everything that is done is setting the team up for success. Now, I'm not saying that there wasn't the absolute goal or aim for the club to be doing that. That they would have been doing that. Their belief would have been that every decision they made was to set the club up for success. I want them to accept the fact that some mistakes have been made, own it, continue the goal that they would have had to set the club up for success, but acknowledge that there's things that they could have and should have done better, do them better. And of course, you know that how I feel about the Darwin trip, but that's one minor thing. That's actually a minor thing
in the big picture at the moment right now. Yeah,
right,
absolutely.
Right. But it's an example, right? Everything that we do, every decision that is made regarding the football operation, the guiding factor has to be, will this make it better for the club to achieve success? And if in any way, it creates a block to success, we shouldn't go with it. And I think, unfortunately, there's been some calls that have been made around processes or decisions that have been made where the intent was success, the outcome wasn't, and that's where we really have to reflect on it. John, I think that pretty much wraps up what we needed to cover. We will have, of course, our usual Tuesday news podcast that we record, which goes out on Wednesday. You'll be getting this today as our special edition. We could call it an instant reaction, but it's really one of our special edition podcasts. Our thanks to sponsors, Star Partners Real Estate, Auburn, Narellan, and Parramatta, that make it possible for us to provide all of this content for you. Our thanks to the listeners. You know, John, we've just been inundated with messages, the kind words about our podcasts. It's just, blows my mind that we have so many people that reach out because the podcast either resonates with them or they appreciate the content with it. I'll send a shout out as well to Ray from Maroubra, who came and introduced himself to me at the Jersey Flegg match between the Eels and the Bunnies up at Kellyville on Saturday, and we sat and had a good chinwag about where things are at with Parramatta, but also we reminisced about some of the players and matches from the past. So it was an enjoyable chat with Ray. So, Ray, I'm sure you're listening. You told me you listened to all of this, so you're getting I just wanted to thank you for coming over and saying g'day, and I really appreciated that. So, John, thank you for being available for this early Monday morning recording. Thank you again, as I said, to our listeners. And as we always say, go you mighty Eels.